Elizabeth Morgan's heels clicked sharply against the polished floor of Westfield Mall as she guided 8-year-old Mia through the weekend crowd. Summer air conditioning battled the July heat while mother and daughter window shopped, a rare Saturday together. Without warning, Mia's breath caught. Her small hand gripped Elizabeth's fingers with sudden intensity. "Mom," she gasped, eyes widening with familiar fear. Elizabeth dropped her shopping bags, kneeling beside her daughter, whose lips were already turning an alarming shade of blue. Frantically rummaging through her designer purse, Elizabeth's heart sank. The inhaler wasn't there. As Mia collapsed against her, wheezing desperately for air, Elizabeth screamed for help. The crowd parted as a uniformed security guard rushed forward, his face set with unexpected determination. Daniel Reed hadn't planned on saving anyone's life during his Saturday shift at Westfield Mall. At 39, his life had settled into a predictable rhythm, far removed from the adrenaline-fueled days in the emergency room. 5 years ago, he'd been Dr. Reed, respected pediatric emergency physician with publications in leading medical journals. Now he wore a Navy security uniform, carried a walkie-talkie instead of a stethoscope, and made just enough to keep his 10-year-old daughter Sophie in their modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The career change had raised eyebrows among his former colleagues, but for Daniel, the choice had been simple. Sophie needed a father more than his patients needed another doctor. The divorce had been swift and merciless. His ex-wife Jennifer had found companionship with a fellow surgeon who didn't cancel dinner plans for emergency cases, who didn't miss school plays because a child was coding, who didn't carry the weight of life and death decisions home every night. "It's not that I don't love you," she had said while packing her things. "It's that you love medicine more than anything else." The irony wasn't lost on Daniel that when she left with nothing but a suitcase and her medical credentials, leaving him Sophie and her severe asthma to manage alone, he'd ultimately chosen to leave medicine behind too. Elizabeth Morgan hadn't climbed to the position of CEO at Meridian Pharmaceuticals by the age of 35 by being unprepared. Her entire life was structured around anticipating problems before they materialized. Board meetings, product launches, quarterly projections. She handled them all with a composure that had earned her profiles in Forbes and Business Insider. Yet motherhood remained the one arena where she felt perpetually inadequate. The weight of being both mother and father to Mia, since her ex-husband departed for his fresh start with his 24-year-old assistant, had left Elizabeth with a constant undercurrent of guilt. She compensated with efficiency. The best schools, the most experienced nannies, the top pediatric specialists for Mia's asthma. But no amount of money could buy the one thing Elizabeth couldn't seem to provide: enough of herself. The mall's security office was quiet compared to the shopping floor chaos. Daniel watched the little girl's breathing ease as the medication from his emergency inhaler took effect. He'd recognized the symptoms immediately, the same panic he'd seen in Sophie's eyes countless times. "Better?" he asked, his voice gentler than his uniform suggested. Mia nodded, her dark curls bouncing slightly, color returning to her cheeks. Daniel noted her expensive clothes, the designer label on her mother's dropped bags. The woman herself, early 30s, sharp-tailored pantsuit despite the weekend, diamond studs in her ears, exuded authority even in crisis. "I don't know how to thank you," Elizabeth said, maintaining her composure despite the tremor in her hands. She reached for her wallet. "Please, let me—" "No need," Daniel interrupted, recognizing the gesture. "Rich people always thought money was the answer. I have a daughter with asthma, too. I always carry a spare." He didn't mention he was once the doctor who had lectured parents about emergency preparedness, about never forgetting inhalers. Elizabeth's perfectly manicured hand hesitated, then withdrew from her purse without the wallet. Something shifted in her expression. Embarrassment, perhaps, or wounded pride? "I've never forgotten her inhaler before," she said, defensive edge sharpening her tone. "It was right on my desk. I had a conference call this morning that ran late and—" She stopped herself, straightening her shoulders. "I'm Elizabeth Morgan, this is Mia." "Daniel Reed," he replied, noticing how she didn't offer her hand to shake. "The inhaler is just a temporary fix. You should have her checked by a doctor." "Of course," Elizabeth said, already reaching for her phone. "Our specialist is on speed dial." The implied distinction was clear. her world of private specialists versus his mall security badge. Mia looked up at her mother, then at Daniel. "Thank you for helping me breathe again," she said, with unexpected grace for someone so young. Daniel smiled truly this time. "You're very welcome, Mia. You handled that like a champ." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "This has my number, just in case you need backup again." Elizabeth took the card mechanically, already dialing with her other hand. Daniel recognized his dismissal. As he walked back to his post, he wondered if the woman even realized she hadn't actually said thank you herself. 2 weeks passed before Daniel saw them again. He was monitoring the food court when a small voice called his name. Mia waved enthusiastically, dragging a more reluctant Elizabeth toward him. The CEO looked different in casual clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, though the designer sunglasses perched on her head probably cost more than his weekly salary. "Mr. Reed, look what I made you." Mia thrust a homemade card into his hands, decorated with glitter and a surprisingly accurate drawing of an inhaler with wings. "My superhero inhaler, man," she explained seriously. "Mom said we should thank you properly." There was something rehearsed about the words, but the sentiment in her eyes seemed genuine. Elizabeth shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. "We were wondering if you'd join us for ice cream? If you're not too busy with," she gestured vaguely at his uniform, "security things." Daniel checked his watch. "My break's in 10 minutes. I could meet you at the ice cream place near the east entrance." The awkward ice cream date became an unexpected turning point. Daniel watched as Elizabeth's professional facade gradually softened while Mia peppered him with questions about his daughter, about why he carried an inhaler, about whether being a security guard was scary. When Mia mentioned a school project about community helpers, Elizabeth mentioned they might stop by the mall again next weekend, her tone making it half question, half statement. "Sophie would love to meet Mia," Daniel found himself saying. "She's always looking for friends who understand the whole inhaler thing." He hadn't planned to say it. Crossing the professional boundary wasn't something he did lightly, but watching Mia's face light up made him glad he had. "Sophie has asthma too?" Elizabeth asked, genuine interest replacing her earlier reserve. "Since she was 4, Daniel nodded. "It was actually why I became interested in pediatric emergency medicine." He stopped, realizing he'd said more than intended. Elizabeth's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched slightly. "You were in medicine?" "In another life," Daniel said, deflecting with a smile. The conversation moved on, but he caught Elizabeth studying him with newfound curiosity. The mall became a regular weekend destination for Elizabeth and Mia. Sometimes they'd find Daniel during his shift, sometimes they'd miss him. Elizabeth told herself it was for Mia's sake. The girl had few friends who truly understood what living with asthma meant. But privately, she recognized something refreshing in Daniel's straightforward manner. He spoke to her like a person, not as the intimidating CEO everyone at Meridian tiptoed around. During one visit, Mia suffered a mild asthma attack after running excitedly between stores. Daniel appeared almost immediately, calm and capable, talking Mia through breathing exercises with practiced ease. "You seem to know a lot about asthma management for a security guard," Elizabeth commented afterward, no accusation in her tone, just genuine curiosity. Daniel hesitated before answering. "I was an ER doctor specializing in pediatrics. Respiratory issues were my focus." Elizabeth's expression registered genuine surprise. "What happened?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people danced around it, sensing a story but too uncomfortable to ask outright. "Life happened," he answered simply. "Sophie needed one parent who could be there consistently. Hospital shifts aren't exactly conducive to single parenting." For the first time, Elizabeth looked at him without the invisible barrier of their different worlds. "No, they're not," she agreed softly. "Neither are CEO responsibilities." Something unspoken passed between them. Mutual recognition of sacrifices made, paths diverted by parenthood. The turning point came during Meridian Pharmaceuticals' annual charity gala benefiting children's health research. Elizabeth stood at the podium, hair elegantly swept up, designer gown catching the light as she addressed the room of industry leaders and philanthropists. She was in her element, articulate and commanding as she announced Meridian's latest initiative funding pediatric research herself. From the back of the ballroom, a server dropped a tray of glasses with a resounding crash. The sound barely registered with most guests. But Elizabeth noticed one small figure at a children's table, bolt upright, panic written across her face. A dark-haired girl about Mia's age was gasping for breath, her small hand clutching at her throat. Without conscious thought, Elizabeth rushed from the stage toward the child, recognizing the signs instantly from Mia's episodes. As she knelt beside the girl, a familiar voice cut through the confused murmurs. "She!" Daniel pushed through the crowd, his rented tuxedo incongruous with the urgency in his movements. He dropped beside his daughter, already reaching for an inhaler in his pocket. Elizabeth stepped back, watching as Daniel handled the situation with practiced calm, speaking softly to Sophie while administering the medication. Only when the girl's breathing eased did Elizabeth process the incongruity of his presence. Before she could speak, the event coordinator appeared at her elbow. "Ms. Morgan, I'm so sorry for the disruption. Dr. Reed was one of our honorees tonight. His research on affordable asthma treatments for underserved communities was groundbreaking before he left the field. We had no idea his daughter would have an episode." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. Dr. Daniel Reed. The name had seemed vaguely familiar when they'd first met, but Elizabeth had dismissed it. Now she remembered the research proposal that had crossed her desk 3 years ago. An innovative, cost-inefficient livery system, designed specifically for children from low-income backgrounds, a proposal she had personally rejected for funding because the profit margins weren't compelling enough for Meridian's shareholders. Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes over his daughter's head. The recognition in his expression told her he'd made the connection too. In the sterile language of corporate decision-making, she had deemed his life's work not commercially viable. And now here they were, connected by their children's shared vulnerability and a decision that had altered the course of his career. "You're the Elizabeth Morgan," he said later, when Sophie had been taken home by his mother and they found themselves alone in the quiet of the hotel's deserted garden terrace. Not a question, but a statement of recognition. "And you're Dr. Reed," she replied, her usual confidence faltering. "I didn't make the connection. Would it have mattered if you had?" The question held no accusation, just weary curiosity. Elizabeth considered lying, then decided against it. "Probably not," she admitted. "Business decisions aren't personal." "They were to me," Daniel said quietly. "That research was going to help thousands of kids like Sophie and Mia, kids whose parents can't afford the fancy specialists and premium medications." "The board," Elizabeth began. "Follows your recommendations," Daniel finished for her. "I did my homework when I submitted that proposal. I knew exactly who made the final call." The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. Elizabeth was unaccustomed to defending her professional decisions in personal settings. She'd built walls between those worlds, precisely to avoid moments like this. "For what it's worth," she finally said, "your project had merit. The timing was wrong. We were focusing our philanthropy on cancer research that year." Daniel's laugh held no humor. "Convenient. Cancer research makes for better press than helping poor kids breathe." The accusation stung because it contained an element of truth. Elizabeth had built her reputation on bold, headline-grabbing initiatives. Pediatric asthma treatments weren't sexy enough for the brand she'd cultivated for Meridian. "That's unfair," she said, though without her usual conviction. "Is it?" Daniel stood, straightening his rented tuxedo jacket. "Life's unfair, Elizabeth. Some of us just experience that truth earlier than others." He turned to leave, then paused. "Thank you for trying to help Sophie. She's going to be fine, by the way, not that you asked." The following weeks created a chasm between them. Daniel switched to weekday shifts, avoiding the weekends when Elizabeth and Mia might visit. Elizabeth told herself it was for the best. Boundaries restored, no more confusion about their different worlds. But Mia asked for him constantly, her disappointment palpable when they couldn't find the inhaler hero during mall visits. "Why don't we see Mr. Daniel anymore?" Mia asked one evening, as Elizabeth tucked her into bed. "Is he mad at us?" Elizabeth smoothed her daughter's curls, buying time. He's just busy, sweetie. People have complicated lives. Is it because of grown-up stuff? Like when you and Daddy stopped talking before he went away? The innocent question landed like a physical blow. Elizabeth had worked so hard to shield Mia from the messier aspects of adult relationships, yet children always sensed more than adults gave them credit for. It's different, Elizabeth said carefully. Mr. Daniel and I we come from different worlds. But we breathe the same air, Mia said with the simple wisdom of childhood. That's what he told me. Everyone needs help breathing sometimes. Elizabeth lay awake that night, her daughter's words echoing in her mind. On impulse, she opened her laptop and searched for Daniel Reed's research. What she found humbled her. His work hadn't just been scientifically sound, it had been revolutionary in its simplicity and accessibility. The delivery system he'd designed could have reduced emergency room visits for asthma by 40% in underserved communities. All those children who might have been helped, whose families might have been spared financial hardship from medical bills and missed work. She pulled up the internal memo she'd written recommending against funding the project. Insufficient market potential and limited commercial applications jumped out at her. Corporate speak that now felt hollow when she pictured Sophie's frightened face at the gala, Mia's blue lips at the mall. The truth was, she hadn't given the proposal the attention it deserved. It had been one of dozens she'd reviewed that day, and she'd been focused on impressing the board with her business acumen, not her humanitarian insight. Elizabeth's revelation came at a steep price. 2 weeks later, Mia experienced her worst asthma attack yet. It struck in the middle of the night, severe, frightening, the inhaler barely helping. The pediatrician's after-hours line recommended immediate emergency care. As Elizabeth sped toward the hospital, Mia's breathing growing more labored in the back seat, she found herself taking the exit that would pass by Daniel's apartment complex. She'd noted the address from his employee file after the gala, telling herself it was just due diligence. The complex was modest but well-maintained. Elizabeth parked haphazardly, carrying a wheezing Mia to the building. Finding his name on the directory, she pressed the buzzer repeatedly, desperation overriding propriety. Daniel appeared at the door in sweatpants and a faded t-shirt, confusion turning to alarm when he saw Mia's condition. Without a word, he ushered them inside, professional instincts immediately overriding any personal feelings. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, already examining Mia with practiced movements. "About 40 minutes, Elizabeth managed, her CEO composure nowhere to be found. "The inhaler isn't working well enough. We were headed to the emergency room, but this was on the way and She stopped, realizing how it sounded. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "You did exactly right," Daniel interrupted, his focus entirely on Mia. He retrieved a nebulizer from a cabinet and quickly set it up. "This will help more than the inhaler. Sophie uses it during her bad episodes." As the medication began to ease Mia's symptoms, the tension in the room gradually shifted. Elizabeth sank onto the couch, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. Daniel's apartment told its own story. Medical textbooks sharing shelf space with children's novels. Framed diplomas next to Sophie's artwork. Everything modest but meticulously organized. "Thank you," Elizabeth said when Mia had fallen asleep on the couch, her breathing finally normalized. "I don't know what I would have done if—" "You'd have gotten her to the hospital," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "You're a capable mother, Elizabeth." The simple vote of confidence nearly undid her. How long had it been since anyone had acknowledged her parenting without qualification? In the corporate world, she was respected, feared even. As a mother, she constantly felt judged and found wanting. "I've been thinking about your research," she said abruptly. "The asthma delivery system for underserved communities." Daniel's expression closed immediately. "Ancient history." "It shouldn't be," Elizabeth persisted. "It was a good project, an important one. And yet, not profitable enough," he said, the bitterness evident despite his attempt at nonchalance. Elizabeth met his gaze directly. "I made a mistake. The kind that's easy to make from a corner office where you never see the faces of the people affected by your decisions." The admission hung between them, unexpected and weighty. Daniel studied her face, searching for insincerity and finding none. Why are you telling me this now? Because tonight I wasn't a CEO making decisions based on profit margins and market projections. I was just a mother terrified of losing her child, driving to the one person I knew could help. Elizabeth glanced at Mia's sleeping form. And because I've spent 3 weeks wondering why a brilliant doctor is working security shifts at a mall instead of saving lives. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't just the funding rejection, he finally said. That was the last straw. Jennifer, my ex-wife, left around the same time, said I cared more about my patients than our marriage. He gave a humorless laugh. Then when Sophie's asthma worsened and I couldn't be there consistently because of hospital shifts, I made a choice. Between being a good doctor and a good father, Elizabeth surmised. Daniel nodded. Security work has regular hours. The pay is enough. Sophie needs stability more than I need professional fulfillment. Does she need you to sacrifice everything that made you who you are? The question was gentle, without judgment. Daniel looked startled, as though the thought had never occurred to him quite that way. Before he could answer, a small voice interrupted from the doorway. Dad? Is everything okay? Sophie stood there in pajamas printed with planets and stars, her dark hair tousled from sleep. Everything's fine, sweetie, Daniel assured her. This is Ms. Morgan and her daughter Mia. Mia wasn't feeling well, so they stopped by for some help. Sophie's eyes went to the nebulizer, then to Mia's sleeping form. Understanding dawned in her expression. She has asthma too? Elizabeth nodded. Just like you. Sophie approached cautiously. Is she going to be okay? Thanks to your dad, yes, Elizabeth said. The simple truth of those words settled something within her. The emergency room visit was brief. A precautionary check after the nebulizer treatment had stabilized Mia's condition. As dawn broke, Elizabeth found herself driving home with a sleeping child and a clarity she hadn't felt in years. By 8 a.m., she was on the phone with Meridian's head of research and development. I want to revisit a project we passed on 3 years ago, she said without preamble. A pediatric asthma treatment delivery system designed by Dr. Daniel Reed. The mall security guard. The confusion in her colleague's voice confirmed Elizabeth's suspicion that Daniel's career change had become industry gossip. The brilliant medical researcher whose work we overlooked, Elizabeth corrected firmly. I want a full reassessment with current market conditions and a focus on social impact, not just profit potential. The following week was a flurry of activity. Elizabeth dove into research, consulting with pediatric specialists, reviewing Daniel's original proposal and the advances in the field since then. What she found only reinforced her conviction. His approach had been revolutionary, addressing both medical and socioeconomic barriers to treatment. When the package arrived at Daniel's apartment, he opened it with suspicion. Inside was a comprehensive business proposal, his original research, updated, expanded, and positioned within a new initiative focusing on accessible healthcare solutions. A post-it note in elegant handwriting simply read, "Some mistakes can be corrected. Meridian's board meeting is next Thursday at 2 p.m. Your perspective would be valuable. E.M." Daniel read the material twice, professional interest warring with personal hurt. The proposal was excellent. Elizabeth had clearly done her homework, addressing the very obstacles that had derailed his research initially. But the wounds were still raw, the memory of rejection still bitter. He was still deliberating when Sophie came home from school, immediately noticing the medical journals spread across the table, a sight once common but absent for years. "Are you going back to being a doctor?" she asked, hope lifting her voice. "No, honey, just looking at some old research." Sophie picked up one of the journals, flipping through pages of familiar diagrams. "I miss when you talked about helping kids breathe better," she said simply. "You smiled more then." The board meeting was already underway when Daniel arrived, his security uniform exchanged for the one suit he'd kept from his medical days. Elizabeth's assistant ushered him into the boardroom without question, as though his presence had been expected all along. Elizabeth stood at the head of the table, commanding in her corporate armor of a tailored suit and unwavering confidence. She faltered momentarily when she saw him, genuine surprise flickering across her features before she recovered. "Dr. Reed, thank you for joining us," she said, professional mask firmly in place. "We were just discussing the potential impact of affordable asthma interventions in underserved communities." For the next hour, Daniel found himself drawn back into the world he'd abandoned. Medical terminology flowing easily, passion reigniting as he explained the nuances of his research to attentive executives. Elizabeth guided the conversation masterfully, positioning the project not as charity, but as innovation with long-term market potential. When the vote came, unanimous approval for funding, Daniel felt a complex surge of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also regret for the years lost, and something unexpected. Admiration for Elizabeth's strategic brilliance in repositioning his work for a corporate audience that spoke only the language of profit. "Why did you do this?" he asked later, when the boardroom had emptied and they stood alone among abandoned coffee cups and presentation materials. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally. "And because watching you explain your research to that room of suits reminded me why I got into pharmaceuticals in the first place, before quarterly projections and shareholder value became my primary focus." "To help people," Daniel supplied. "To make a difference," Elizabeth agreed. "Somewhere along the way, I started measuring difference in dollars instead of lives improved." She gathered her papers, movements precise but her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Mia asks about you, both of you. She misses her breathing buddy." The simple phrase bridged something between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. "Sophie's been talking about her too," Daniel admitted. "Apparently having asthma is less awful when someone else understands." "Children are wiser than we give them credit for," Elizabeth said. "Speaking of which, I have a proposal for you that has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals or business models." Daniel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Mia's school is having a career day next week. They've asked parents to discuss how their work helps the community." Elizabeth hesitated, uncharacteristic uncertainty crossing her features. "I could talk about drug development and corporate responsibility, but I think the second graders might appreciate someone who actually saves lives. If you're willing." It was a small olive branch, but a significant one. Elizabeth Morgan, who controlled a pharmaceutical empire, was acknowledging that his contribution, even in a security uniform, mattered more than hers in the ways that truly counted. 6 months later, the Breathe Easy Clinic opened in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. The modest building housed state-of-the-art equipment alongside an education center where families could learn asthma management techniques. Daniel served as medical director 3 days a week, balancing the role with his security position, which he'd kept out of both pragmatism and principle. Elizabeth had offered funding for his full-time return to medicine, but Daniel had declined. Some lessons in priorities were worth preserving. The clinic's waiting room was filled with children's artwork, colorful depictions of lungs, inhalers with superhero capes, and clouds that transformed into friendly shapes. Among them hung a framed crayon drawing signed by both Mia and Sophie, 2 little girls holding hands, breathing freely under a bright blue sky. On weekend afternoons, the 4 of them sometimes met at the park. Not as CEO and security guard, not as doctor and businesswoman, but simply as 2 parents whose children had forged a connection through shared experience. Elizabeth was learning to leave her phone in the car during these outings. Daniel was rediscovering the joy of discussing medical journals without the weight of hospital bureaucracy. They weren't a family in any traditional sense. The wounds that had shaped them, divorces, career setbacks, parental guilt, remained part of their individual stories. But watching their daughters chase each other through autumn leaves, inhalers securely stashed in pockets but rarely needed these days, both adults recognized something had healed that was larger than either of them alone. "Do you ever regret it?" Elizabeth asked one afternoon as they sat on a park bench, watching the girls feed ducks at the pond's edge. "Walking away from medicine when you did?" Daniel considered the question, his gaze following Sophie's animated gestures as she explained something to Mia. "I regret that it felt like an either/or choice," he said finally. being there for Sophie, or helping other children. I'm starting to think the best answers are rarely at the extremes. Elizabeth nodded, understanding in her eyes. She'd scaled back her 60-hour work weeks, delegated more, learned that Meridian could function without her constant presence. The company hadn't suffered. If anything, her fresh perspective had brought new energy to initiatives that balanced profit with purpose. As the autumn sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, neither adult rushed to check the time or mention pending obligations. Some lessons, once learned, reshape priorities in ways that can't be undone. And sometimes the people who challenge our worldview most profoundly are the ones who help us breathe more easily in the end.